Hi, everybody. For those who have managed to join us, apologies for the delays. This is our first attempt at a live conversation. So my name is Mike Ward. I work with R3. I run our product management and developer relations teams. So we wanted to try a new format here. We thought it was a great opportunity to use YouTube Live and have a conversation with some of the people we normally talk to that we don't normally have the opportunity to allow external participation in. So in this time, it's difficult for us to do user groups and that type of thing. We don't manage to get the in-person interaction. So we thought we'd try this format. So we're very lucky today. We have with us Ryan from Ivno. So Ryan's going to talk us through effectively what is a tokenized version of cash that they are working on over at Ivno. So this is a really exciting space. So he's going to talk through that with us today. So let's get started. I am just going to very briefly allow my co-presenters to introduce themselves. So I have Case and Narina. You guys want to introduce yourselves real quick? Can you guys hear me?
Are they both on mute?
I think you guys are on mute.
Hello, I'm Irina, Relations at R3.
Hi everyone, let me try that again. Hi, I'm Case Manet. I'm one of the product managers at R3. I'm in the payments. A lot of you probably know me from my previous life in DevRel. Hey everyone.
So thanks for learning along with us, everybody who's patient enough to watch this. So why don't we get started then? First, I want to just introduce Ryan. So Ryan, obviously you do a better job of introducing yourself, and it would be really good if you can give us a little bit of background, not about Ivno just yet, but about Ryan. Where did you come from, Ryan, and what's your background?
Sure. So I think I'm off mute, but my background's in creating enterprise-grade software. I've created enterprise-grade software for around 12 years now, architected, builders, etc. I come from a DLT background as of around 4 years ago now. I ran development at an Ethereum token company called Funfair. At Funfair, we were the first to introduce, to architect and introduce a layer 2 scaling solution in state channels. I'm also Hyperledger trained, and of course, I'm Corda certified.
Fantastic. Okay, so just to dig in your background a little bit, I think it'd be good before we do actually just to introduce Ivno itself. What's Ivno working on? Why did you guys start Ivno? What problem are you trying to solve? So
Ivno was started by two co-founders, Dan and Chris. And Chris ran a large treasury operation at Letter One. So it was very obvious some of the market limitations of the market currently. So we decided to create a real-time, secure, instant and transparent value movement solution for banks, exchanges, etc. Now there's a lot of words in that introduction, so hopefully we can break those down as we move forward in the conversation. But certainly what's worth mentioning, what's crucial with Ivno, is that we already have a legal and reg compliant structure. So most people start with the tech and then move on to the legal and regs and find that it's actually much harder. But we've done it the other way. We have one of the largest US law firms in securities who've given us a positive opinion on what we're trying to do at Ivno. We have some traction from last year from the Corda trial. So there are 28 organizations. There was 18 banks, 3 exchanges, even the regulator, and they all took part in our global Corda trial. We were the first to use the Corda's token SDK as well, which held up fantastically. So that's us. That's us.
Fantastic.
Sorry, carry on.
That blockchain. It'd be interesting to understand how you feel Ivno would compare to other token types. And in fact, it might be even helpful if you can help us understand what those token types are before you compare them.
Sure. So I missed the first bit of that question. what I think would be useful is if we take a step back and talk about what a token is. So token is a digital representation of value, and as with anything that has value, humans will find a way to transfer said value. Now, these transfers could be made free of charge on a blockchain, but I expect that's rather unusual in financial markets. So there needs to be both a delivery and a payment leg, a delivery assessment leg. Now, there's massive tokenization happening all over financial markets. I think you guys recently partnered with NASDAQ for something similar. So it's happening everywhere at the moment. Now, when something has, or when a token has asset value, you also need a stable coin as such. Now, some of the stable coins you might have heard of, Tether, for example, they're quite opaque. You have to trust that they have the underlying collateral in their bank account. They haven't just rehypothecated or reinvested that. But it's the best they have in current public chains. Now, they also serve the retail market. We're not yet serving the retail market, so we're looking at corporates, banks, exchanges, which is a very different proposition. But let's go back to tokenization. Let's take it a few steps back. Now, with tokens, and the token SDK was actually architected in the same way. With tokens, you can have either a non-fungible token, which might be real estate or a piece of art, and you can also have fungible tokens, which generally can be split and merged. And the difference being that fungible tokens can be traded in swaps and generally have the same value or very little difference between one token and another. So Ivno is a fungible token, and non-fungible tokens might be any type of asset class. Now, Ivno don't take on the non-fungible token as such, but we do take on the settlement leg, which offers a number of benefits in DVP transactions.
So what might be helpful is, a lot of this comes down to this DVP aspect. I think we hear that a lot. So that's delivery versus payment for those that are not familiar with it. So that's the atomic exchange of an asset, right? So you hand me a title and I hand you cash and we both let go at the same time. Then we know, okay, we both got what we wanted out of the transaction. But the settlement itself is very complicated. I've only been in this space for about 4 years, being familiar with finance, very little familiarity with finance prior to that. Can you explain why is settlement so difficult, and why would we need to bring the settlement aspect to the blockchain? What is just in general, any blockchain, the DVP aspect? What's the benefit of that?
Yeah, so there's a number of benefits. So in current financial markets, you're subject to market cutoffs, usually US dollar denominated market cutoffs. A settlement token such as Ivno allows for 24/7 transfer of value. There's the atomic transfer that you just mentioned. So either the transaction completes as a whole, so both the delivery and the settlement leg complete, or if one leg fails, then both legs fail. And that brings me on to something I read in the Financial Times yesterday or today, which a DVP transaction that finishes immediately, that has immediate reconciliation on both sides, it allows for a complete reduction in failures. Now, a failure, just to say that back a step, a failure to deliver is when a transaction is agreed and it's paid for, but the actual asset doesn't end up moving. Maybe it's been too rehypothecated or whatever. Now, given the current financial situation, failures in equities in the EU today are up to a record 12%, which, if you can imagine 12% of every equity transaction, that's a substantial loss, or substantial counterparty risk. So to allow for a
Right, can I just, is that 12%?
12%, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's interesting times, let's say. But still, if you could,
what causes those failures, Ryan?
Sorry?
What causes those failures? So 12% of, sorry, that's financial market transactions, is that right?
Yeah, so equities trades, yeah.
In an equity trade, what would cause a failure in the transaction itself?
So then you may not be able to reconcile the transaction. So from one side, let's say they're buying, I don't know, 1,000 of a stock of some type, but they were expecting to pay for 2,000. There are a number of reasons that it can fail. But obviously, even in the event of a failure, if you can get immediate feedback and immediate reconciliation on both sides, I think RGB says it best when he says, "What you see is what I see," which is one of Corda's maxims, isn't it? But if you know that immediately, you can then solve that failure to deliver. So there's a level of reconciliation that Corda allows, and that Ivno's token design allows.
Is the underlying cause of that reconciliation the fact that you have multiple systems having to talk to each other and they don't speak the same language? Is it human error of keying things in?
Yeah, I expect it's all of the above. All of the above.
Fantastic.
Ryan, there is one question from the audience. Is Ivno direct competition to Ripple XRP?
It isn't. So XRP isn't price stable. Ivno's token is price stable, and equally within any financial market, a large part of the transaction or a large part of the benefit of the transaction, and something I want to keep, is transaction privacy. Now, Corda's peer-to-peer, as we all know, so is Ivno, and to be able to retain that level of transaction privacy isn't something that XRP can currently offer on a public level.
I think that's one of those common sort of misconceptions or misunderstandings between what the difference of a token is versus a coin. Coin is something like, you know, Bitcoin, where, you know, it gets this inherent value from the fact that enough people believe it's worth $10,000. If someone's willing to sell it to me for 10,000 and I pay 10,000, it's worth 10,000, and tomorrow it might be worth 11,000. But a token's very different, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, you brought me onto a good point there, which is, like any currency, it's just a shared belief that this asset is worth something. So a lot of people within public blockchains believe that actually, yes, Tether is worth $1 and it is pegged to $1. And they do have that collateral behind them. Now, rather than rely on consumer trust, and when you're talking about the high value transactions that Ivno's clients will be using, you can't ask them just to operate on trust. So we're using existing market infrastructure or collateral that they would already have in place that they can then repurpose into a token. So previously illiquid markets, which they can clearly see the transparent value of, is now tokenized, and they can now move it 24/7 outside of market cutoffs. They can transfer it atomically, etc.
Another question from Martin. How do investment banks react when we tell them about the Ivno solution?
So we have a lot of interest from investment banks, and actually we've got quite. This is a great question, by the way. Ivno has a large, many use cases. So it can be used for corporate bank transfers. It can be used for collateral management. But one hyper-focused use case that we're focusing on at the moment is uncleared margin rules. Now, there's a couple of tranches coming up, and I think there's been about 4 phases so far, and there's 2 more to come. But they bring in a lot of buy-side institutions, so that market will grow substantially. And it's just one example of where Ivno can help by posting margin, by posting IAM or VM. That's just one single use case, but there's a lot of interest.
Thank you.
Ryan, earlier you touched upon the. Oh, sorry, Mike. We spoken over each other.
Sorry, a few problems with my mute button to work. No, I was just going to ask Ryan, just for kind of a broad purpose, because, you know, looking at some of the questions that are on here, I think some people are confused. You know, where does Ivno fit in the kind of the tokenized world? There's a few XRP questions on there. You've explained kind of how you're a very different use case than XRP effectively. But I'm wondering if you can explain just in a very basic layman's terms, how would this token come about? How does it get used? So in other words, you know, I've purchased stock from somebody on the market. Where would an Ivno token come into play, and how does it even emerge? How does it get issued onto the ledger? When I want to take that Ivno token and turn it into real cash, how would that happen?
Sure. Okay. You'll be excited, Mike, because this is probably a good time to use the blackboard behind.
This was basically teeing you up to use your blackboard.
Can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Brilliant. So let's start with Alice, Bob, and Chris. Now, Alice, Bob, and Chris are part of a equities trading business network, so they can all talk to each other and trade equities between them. Now, Dan, Egbert, and Felicity are all members of the Ivno business network. Now, what does this mean? It means that Dan can issue tokens onto the network, or anyone here can issue tokens onto the network. So what they'll do is they'll deposit funds into the Ivno TIE, so into the existing financial market infrastructure that we use to back our collateral. The Ivno TIE will issue tokens back to Dan. So Dan now has Ivno tokens. Now he can trade with Dan, Egbert, and Felicity. But Chris would also like to make a securities trade, and he would like to use Ivno for the settlement leg. So, from one way to another, we then have the token that appears, comes from Dan, and the securities trade, which will come from Chris on the other leg. Now, as I say, this has to trade atomically. One leg of the transaction can't complete without both legs of the transaction completing. The beauty of this is that Ivno can be seen as a utility layer. And I think we've seen more of these utility layers as more business networks move into production. Now, a utility layer could be KYC, for example. So all of these might have a reason to use KYC utility layer, but Ivno could just be a settlement utility layer. So it can easily integrate with other business networks, even if there's no shared business logic there. Now, of course, you can subscribe to the Ivno TIE in order to issue yourself tokens. You can also redeem them back the same way. And so you can redeem them back into fiat. Now, we don't expect this to happen too often. The collateral is the highest quality collateral available on the market, HQLA #1, which means that actually it's better than cash to keep on your balance sheet. Hopefully that gives you an idea of how it works, of how we settle a DVP transaction, and how we can issue and redeem tokens onto the ledger. Is that helpful?
Thanks, Ryan. You know, one term you used there was HQLA. Would you mind explaining what HQLA is?
Yes, high quality liquid asset. Now, I won't go into too much detail, both because Chris, our co-founder, could do a much better job than I could, and also because it's something that people can research in their own time.
And
so if, please go ahead, guys.
Oh, sorry. But the HQLA is what enables Ivno's token to have price stability, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah. So they tend to give very little yield, but then again, so does cash. In fact, often in negative interest rates, cash loses money. However, it does offer price stability, as you said.
Yeah, just being new to this myself, I stumbled across HQLA based on one of our customers, HQLAX, which tokenizes the HQLA market. In the banking community, high quality liquid assets underpin what? It would probably be helpful to explain where they fit in kind of the structure of the money supply and such.
Yeah, sure. So again, without going into too much detail, generally it's they're bonds or gilts or whatever, and due to something called Basel III, which was introduced after 2008, it's a regulation. There are limits to how much cash a bank can hold onto. So a high quality liquid asset is a way of keeping cash off of your balance sheet, so to speak.
Fantastic. That makes a lot of sense.
So Ryan, my final question on. Oh, sorry, Mike.
No, please go. I thought I was going to tell you you're on mute. You started talking and I couldn't hear. So all good.
Oh, okay. Sorry, my daughter's just appeared and she's managed to cover herself in milk somehow. My question, Ryan, was, so given it's sort of HQLA, does this mean the banks will be able to utilize collateral they already have rather than having to invest in new pools of collateral?
You're making this very easy for me, Case, but yes, that's exactly what it means. They can be reutilized as a token, as an Ivno token.
So Clemens had a question, actually. Hey, Clemens, an old colleague of ours. He wants to know which institutions are pledging collateral. So it feels to me like it's, that's kind of an HQLA from a banking perspective, whereas you're talking about high quality liquid assets that underpin your cash. Is that correct?
So effectively they're the same thing. We use existing market infrastructure. So we have one of the largest fund providers in the world that backs us, and a large US bank as a custodian. Could you repeat the question, Mike?
Yeah, sure. Clemens said, which institutions are pledging collateral?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so a number of institutions is the answer. I can't release them under NDA, unfortunately. But what I can say is that we have exchanges that are interested, we have buy-side firms, and we have a number of banks. But as I say, even though there's many use cases, so it could even be used within large corporates for effectively a cash bank account.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. Martin Lee had a question also. It's a question for Ryan. Will Party A be able to buy Ivno tokens in a trade conducted at the London Stock Exchange and then sell them in another exchange, for example, the Deutsche Börse? And what are the compliance implications if so?
It's a really great question. The answer is yes, it could be used anywhere where we have an integration. Now, Ivno integrates using REST API into the node and socket streaming back out of the node for immediate reconciliation. But the simple answer is yes. Yes, it can be. It can be used within any business network as long as it pertains to that business network's logic, and as long as they follow onboarding, which will include KYC, AML, etc.
Another question from Anthony. With close media attention on central bank digital currencies, what, if any, interaction would there be between Ivno and CBDC were they to be released?
It's a great question, and I think there's a few interesting cross sections. I actually think CBDC are probably some years away from. I know China and a few other countries are chasing that as we speak. I think Ivno is a market solution, whereas central bank digital currency will maybe look more at a tiered model. So maybe like a layer 1 bank and a layer 2 retail. That's potentially something that they look at. Now, a concern for me would be skipping the banks. So you can use central bank digital currency. Does that effectively remove commercial banks' interest in the market? Potentially, I don't know. But there's better people than me to answer that question. I deal mainly with the tech.
Ryan, can I pivot here real quick? So, a lot of what we talked about is thinking of the perspective of the business use case. So creating a DVP transaction. So you're enabling the P part of the DVP, obviously. So from a developer's perspective, how do I write my contract so I can use Ivno's token to do the settlement?
Sure. So Ivno token is price stable, as we know. So there will need to be some sort of price discovery or value on the tokenized asset. But then effectively, without giving away too much of the secret sauce, you would just include both within a transaction, and then the transaction would have to complete atomically in its entirety.
Okay. So in the Corda model, that, in case you can probably explain this also, in the Corda model, because I think a lot of people wouldn't be familiar with the Corda model and how this works. You have the state, which captures the properties, you have the contract, which is the logic around transformation, and then the flows. In case, correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe add some detail, it's two contracts are connected by the flows in this case. So they would need to write the logic that consumes your contract. Is that a safe way to, layman's terms, to summarize it, high level?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So yeah, so the idea would be you would write your Corda that encapsulates, all your logic for whatever use case you're solving for, and you would then leverage, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, Ivno's solution. And yeah, to your point, Mike, you'd have a flow, and that at some point would recognize that some sort of settlement needs to take place for this use case, and it would call out to Ivno's solution, generate coins or whatever it has to do, and it would end up building what's known as a transaction builder. And in this transaction builder, you would add your state, so you'd add the items to be transferred over, and you'd add your settlement token, and then that would then go off to the network to be signed, finalized, etc.
Exactly that. Yeah.
So there's a couple of good questions on here also. Oh, go ahead, please. Sorry, Ryan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you call into Ivno subflows as long as the contract is pertained to, i.e. both are known parties, both are known entities that have been KYC'd, etc., attested to, then you would just have to write that transfer logic. And I know there's been discussions at an R3 level to include some protocol level settlement providers, which of course we'd love to be a part of.
Yeah, and that's the area Case is working in today, and he's our subject matter expert. So Case will be providing the world with that soon, hopefully, so they can abstract away that underlying token. In fact, there's a couple questions along these lines. Effectively, how would they get a hold of your contract? Is it open source? Is it something they need to create a relationship with you first? How do they get started? And then along the lines of the open source question, how do they understand what's happening underneath the covers and kind of give themselves confidence, I guess?
So we build on Corda Enterprise. We offer a friction-free developer experience. We can spin you up a node. We have a number of scripts that Terraform scripts, etc. will provision a node, spin you up a node, and then you can use that node within a test or UAT environment to then connect out to either within Corda or other systems. So you might have external systems that call in via the REST API. So there are a number of off-chain processes that need to take place. So it's not something you can just grab the Corda and spin up, but it's friction-free as long as you pertain to KYC and AML. Then it's relatively easy to get hold of.
So that's a good question also then on the KYC AML aspects. You need to form against anybody using, or is that done by the consumers of the token or the business network, I guess you'd think of it as?
Mike, if you could repeat the question, you've been cut off.
Yeah, apologies. I think my bandwidth seems to be suffering right at the right moment. So the KYC AML aspect, so more the KYC, so know your customer, for those who aren't familiar with it, is the process whereby you're required by the FATFA, I always get the acronym mixed up, but within the banking community, any funds that are transferred, the banks need to understand who the customers are. So they need to understand, are they sanctioned, are they politically exposed, et cetera. So that's the KYC process of the bank when they onboard a customer, of having to go through that. Banks and other institutions. AML then being, anti-money laundering being kind of the analysis of the transfer itself. Did it get transferred to a party who's sanctioned, et cetera? How does Ivno manage that process, or does Ivno manage that process and expect instead that it's managed on the consumer side of it?
Yeah, so that's something that one of our partners takes on. We do have a design in place, so we use reference states. So the reference state will attest to having been onboarded and being KYC'd. And of course, we pertain to AML. It's relatively easy to use query criteria to search through the vault and hand over any potential transactions that might not pass AML or that regulators might want. It's very easy to pull that out of Corda and over.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. And that's always something that is struggle even in the public blockchains, right? There's no KYC AML happening. So Clemens had another interesting commentary, actually, and it's probably best to address it directly. How do you avoid becoming a single point of failure effectively? And I think I know the answer to that, but
that's a fantastic question. And it's something we battled with right from the start. Now, it's fair to say that for issuances and redemptions, of course, you need the TIE node there. Someone needs to attest that they've received the funds and then issue the tokens. So for issuance and redemption, that's no problem. But for transfers, we wanted to remove the TIE as a bottleneck. So rather than having the TIE or any Ivno party included as a participant within the transaction, because then, of course, as soon as that TIE node goes down, the whole network stops operating. So to prevent that, the transfer legs aren't needed to sign by the TIE.
Okay. So in other words, the TIE is only there for converting cash to tokens and converting tokens to cash. After it's tokenized, I can pass it to you, you can pass it to Case can pass it to Renia, but the TIE node is not involved in any of those. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other question here, from Martin Lee, so does an Ivno token trade have to be conducted by a third party, for example, a stock exchange, or can a trade happen within Corda?
Yeah, so that's a brilliant question. So I talk about this on my Medium blog about interoperability, and I think there's two levels of interoperability. I think you've got intra-blockchain, which is Corda-based. Now, of course, most of these DVP transactions that occur will lean on Corda and will use Corda to express atomic. So that's certainly one of our use cases. But then further down the line, and I think probably every DLT protocol is heading towards this, is inter-blockchain. So you talk about Cosmos, Polkadot, whatever. But being able to use maybe Ethereum as a second layer, whilst transaction privacy is on Corda, for example. And I think eventually opening up all of those disparate DLT protocols to each other is analogous to the internet and the intranet era. So mid-1990s, everything was an internet, but we're moving towards DLTs becoming connected in an internet.
Fantastic. And I think, how would you, in Intraledger, and not to drag you too far away from the token itself, you're somebody who's kind of an expert in this area, and as the issuer of this asset, you bear the risk, right? So if something goes wrong with it, you would bear the risk. How do you, when you're in one blockchain platform, you
Mike, you're cut off again. Could you please repeat the question?
You're on mute, I think, Mike.
We'll get better at this as we go. So on the inter-blockchain aspect, I'm very, very curious, actually. It's very topical in the industry to talk about, transactions going between blockchains, right? So from my perspective, we're very focused on standing up these networks before we're too worried about connecting them, right? But obviously, Ryan, as these business processes get more complex, somebody's going to want your token to be onboarded in one physical network and carried over to a different blockchain technology potentially. How technically do you envision that occurring?
So,
at the simplistic level, of course.
Sure. So I think it exists in some fashion already. I think you guys took part in the Jasper Ivno project. Does that sound about right? And I think you were using hash time lock contracts, which was originally a Bitcoin concept. But effectively, you time lock an asset on one chain whilst the other asset is time locked on the other chain, and then they will both exchange at the same time. I don't think I should go into too much more detail about how to do that, but of course, Corda Settler does something very similar.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, the one thing that I struggled with that pattern effectively is as an issuer, I think you must then need to operate a node in both networks. Is that correct? So you can lock something in one network while issuing it on another network, and vice versa. Destroy it on one and reissue. So it's more about using yourself as an intermediary because you're responsible for the asset on both sides.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's a rudimentary design, but I think as we get better at interconnecting protocols, there'll be some ingenious ways to do it, I'm sure.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to ask another question on behalf of Clemens. Clemens did work for R3 for quite a while, so he's very familiar with our technology. So Clemens asked
some work on interoperability, actually.
And he did work on interoperability. So Clemens asked, do all parties that have core apps with assets also need to agree to use the same notary as Ivno to have DVP? I would add to that, who would operate that notary if so?
Sure. So at the moment, we just use the Corda Network notary. But of course, you can use a notary change transaction if you wanted to do so. And Clemens is right that you would have to have both assets, so both the D and the P. They would both have to be notarized by the same notary.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Fantastic. And Irene, if you want to tee up another question, feel free to jump in.
So Ryan, what is the Corda Network? For those that don't know.
Good question. I suspect you're better placed to answer that than I am, but the Corda Network, as I understand it, is the canonical, currently R3 Corda Network. So it's a network of nodes. R3 currently run it, but I think we're moving it to the Corda Network Foundation, which will be largely community driven. So any decisions that need to be made on the network, so notary changes or whatever, will be agreed upon by the nominated members of the Corda Network Foundation. But effectively, it's Corda's version of the internet.
Another questions from Melinda. What makes the transactions legally enforceable?
That's a great question, and one I probably can't answer in full, otherwise I'll get into a lot of trouble. But I'll revert back to what I said earlier, which was we have one of the biggest leading US law firms who've given us a positive opinion that it is legally enforceable. Now, of course, banks and exchanges and whoever's onboarded will, of course, need to do their own due diligence there, but we are confident.
Ryan, what is the challenge in it being legally enforceable? Is it the technology itself, just being that it's a new technology and the fact that it's occurring in a way that's not wet signatured and such?
Yeah, again, I can't say too much, but effectively, yes. It's something that's new to tech, so it's at the leading edge of tech. So of course, it's also at the leading edge of financial services. And I think there have been some negative connotations that come from the word token, for example, with the big bull run that happened in 2017. So there are a lot of negative connotations in the crypto market from them. So it's breaking down some of those barriers into a viable legal opinion, which pertains to the regulations that for these sorts of things.
One question on that then is I think a lot of groundbreaking things need to be settled in the courts, so there's a ruling. Is that the ultimate path, or is it through some sort of legislation to preempt that?
I'm probably not the right person to answer, but I suspect it's more a case of bi-party agreement, due diligence, etc., as opposed to a big groundbreaking legal battle.
Yep. Okay, that's good. So Belinda has a question on how do users interact with the Ivno system? Is there a custom UI, or do they integrate with existing trading platforms?
So both, whichever you prefer. So as I say, you can integrate with a REST API into the node. So any of your existing business logic might call out to a settlement provider, to an existing settlement provider. You might want some of the efficiencies that Ivno brings. So you can then replace that section of your custom business workflow, your custom logic, and call out to an Ivno node instead. We also offer the same in return, so there's socket streaming back in. Now, for those developers out there that are listening, be aware that within financial markets, sometimes socket streaming doesn't pass some stringent InfoSec policies. So you might need to gracefully degrade that, which we have done. But essentially, there's an input and an output from that. We also have a GUI, and our upcoming UMR pilot and indeed the trial last year both used the GUI. We would expect large corporates to probably use the GUI as opposed to integrations, but it can integrate with any system.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned the trial, by the way. Can you take us through the trial a little bit? What is the trial? What did you guys learn from it? What did you hope to learn from it? Yeah.
So that was last year. That was last summer. It was essentially a beta version of the software, which is now production ready. As I say, there was 28 organizations, 18 banks. I think there was something like $18 billion trial tokens transacted. We demonstrated a rudimentary DBP. And a lot of the feedback we got was actually related to that last question. How do you integrate with a node? And that's something you've got to, that's something every developer developing on Corda should think about. REST APIs are generally known by any developer I've spoken to. So think about that integration layer. Some of the other feedback we got was based on business networks. So everybody that took part in the trial were also thinking about, okay, so what use cases can Ivno enable? Where's that utility layer? What other business networks can I take advantage of Ivno with? So business network integration is something that we're also looking at very closely.
And when you use the term business network, I think we use that a lot internally at R3. What would you, how do you define business network?
So I guess a business network, business networks exist off-chain as well. So a business network might be a gold exchange, let's say a precious metals exchange, which might exist on-chain. But equally, Ivno will have its own business network, and it's the integration of those two, the sharing of that custom business logic, and the agreement of the shared business logic, which needs to make sense when integrating business networks.
Very cool.
Right,
interested in your thoughts on that, actually. How you might define a business network?
Probably the same way. We tend to think of it as the organizations that are collaborating around one business process. So it tends to focus on one Corda app. For us, a distributed application is a Corda distributed application, so Corda app. So it's those of us who share that Corda app. Where it gets more interesting is, so if there's an asset that's tokenized by that issuer, they also need to integrate with network. So that's where you're saying these two networks start coming together. is, the asset business network needs to work with the cash business network in order to do DVP. And I think that's where things get quite interesting, because you have two separate entities who control their own assets but need to work together. So I think that's where blockchain starts getting much more interesting, is when these things occur. And Irina, I might turn to you for a minute and see if there's any questions you wanted to address off the chat window.
Yes, there is a question. How many banks will go live this year, or institutions?
So financial institutions move carefully. So they do a lot of due diligence before they take on a product. By the end of the year, we're expecting at least 3. The UMR pilot will take on more than that.
And there is one question, I think, for Mike. How many customers do Corda have?
That probably wouldn't be a question for me, because I'm not sure of the exact answer. So that's probably something the marketing team should handle. I think a lot of our customers are public, though. We talk often about some of our larger networks. Blockchain is a very interesting technology. I come from a database environment. I can tell you one customer is one person running a database, or one entity. In our world, one customer may have many customers running their own nodes. So you can end up with tens, hundreds of nodes just being underneath one customer. So it's probably more interesting to think about how many nodes are out there, which I also don't know the answer to.
Just to add to that as well, it's with any leading edge solution, you want to start with fewer customers. You want to go through that kind of alpha production period of bringing people on board. But then once you're through that, once you've got through some of the onboarding, then it's much easier to exponentially scale.
Yeah, fantastic. And Irina, I'll let you tear off some questions on there to keep it interactive from the audience.
Clemens one asking, can we use this payment to pay for Corda apps as subscriptions infrastructure?
Yes, I think it would require some code to be written. So I guess you would need to write maybe a portal service that ticks every few days or whatever it might be. But yes, I mean the cost per transaction means that yes, you could use it for any subscription fees, use it for micropayments. Yes.
Ryan, we spoke about the token being backed by HQLA, and I totally understand the quest for price stability. Are there any plans to have the token backed by other assets, or to perhaps create a more generalized token platform where you could tokenize things like art, for example?
So we've had a lot of requests to do that recently. Now, my thoughts on that are you should remain focused until you solve one solution, which is what we're doing at the moment. But however, we can, and we probably will, tokenize other assets in time. Yes, absolutely. We can use the core code and the core infrastructure that we've already built to tokenize, in theory, any asset.
There's another interesting question here from Clemens. So Clemens has inside information. And Clemens, I like this one. I'm probably just putting this up because it's thought-provoking, but can we use this payments to pay for Corda apps themselves or infrastructure? And I guess to a degree that means, can R3 be an Ivno customer? And can this be used to pay? So in a transaction for a non-R3 Corda app, can a component of this be peeled off? An Ivno token goes to pay for the actual transaction.
Yeah, I think so. So I think there's two ways to answer this. And one is that if we work with R3 to add that protocol level choice of settlement provider, then in theory that will be an effortless integration, and you'll be able to integrate that into the marketplace for Corda apps. Yes.
Another question from Belinda. Did you follow any market standards in defining your data model?
From a legal regs point of view, or from a technical point of view?
I think from technical point.
Technical, yeah. So you use ISO 222, I guess, is the cliche in the industry. Everybody feels that's kind of the starting point for payments, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So yes, that's something we're looking at. We built on Corda, which makes that relatively easy. Our hosting provider deals with all those standards.
I guess the one question we should ask up front, why Corda? Your own background, Ryan, is prior to this is very much in the Ethereum space. Excuse me. So why did you move over to the Corda platform?
So there's a number of reasons that we moved over. I think at the time, having moved from Ethereum, where we had to create our own layer 2 solution to scale, DTCC had recently released that study where they proved that they could move the entire US securities market on the Corda ledger. So the scalability was there. I think for financial markets, there's a real push, there's a real need to have transaction privacy. Yeah, you can't be using the gossip protocol to fire your secret market data, your transactions onto a public Ethereum chain, for example. That it just doesn't pertain to existing market needs. So Corda has a appear to be a highly scalable solution.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the brochure, the tagline for us. And of course, I don't mean to try and throw Ethereum under the bus. I think it's a different tool for a different problem. So, and I know you had a good use of it in your last organization. So, excellent. Okay, we only have a couple minutes left. So, Irina, I can turn it over to you guys for questions.
So
Just, sorry.
Sorry, you can say this.
Just quickly, Ryan, are you using any of the other features of Corda? Are you using accounts at all?
Yes, we are using accounts. Now, I guess just to take a step back, that means we can segregate a single node into logical partitions of accounts. This is an absolute necessity, which certainly within large banks. So yes, that is something we're using. Yeah.
And the last question from Martin G. How does Ivno make money from companies using Ivno tokens to trade?
Good question. There's a transaction fee. I mean, given the size of and the level of client that we're talking to, there's generally that's a bi-party conversation that we have with them to create a customized billing solution. But we are using a metering solution in Corda, so we can see how many transactions are taking place. And I think indeed, actually, that's coming in the newest version of Corda Enterprise.
Yeah, in fact, metering is, so for those who aren't familiar with it, in Corda Enterprise, metering is, it allows us to give a very granular view of how much any node has signed transactions effectively is the unit of measure we use. We do that so that our own pricing mechanism for the commercial software is as granular as possible. So, obviously then it becomes consumption-based, formerly a disease, now a pricing model, but it's what people expect in this day and age. They want to pay for what they use effectively. So I think for business networks and such as yourself with Ivno, it allows you not only to get an aggregated view of activity across a set of nodes you don't operate, but to have more insight as to who's doing what effectively. So
Exactly.
Excellent. Let's see if there's any other questions. Otherwise, we can call it at 3 minutes at top of the hour. Will the recording of this be available later? Absolutely. Apologies to those with all the XRP questions. Seems to be a lot of XRP fans out there. That is a very different solution. So I'm not ignoring your questions. They're just not relevant to this conversation. So it sounds like we should have a Q&A on that at some point. I'd be interested to see what the Q&A has in it. It says, going to Corda Network, which is the largest managed network, would definitely improve adoption of the same network. Yeah, and I think this is a key thing. And Ryan, this is probably something you've struggled with a bit. Share the ledger, so that There's variations on that where you can create channels and other technologies. But you want to be part of the biggest network possible, I guess, don't you?
We lost you at the start.
Did I go jittery?
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. I need a new internet connection. Is very apparent. There was a question around the Corda network again, and I think it's we already touched on this a bit, but I think just to explain to the person that asked or pointed out, it's really about just having the biggest network possible, because if you're not on the same network, you can't obviously transact. So it's trying to create the biggest network possible.
Yeah, agreed. And as I said before, the Corda network is effectively horizontally scalable. We did look at Hyperledger initially, but it didn't suit our purposes, mainly because of its channels architecture, which meant that it exponentially grew as we were trying to create the transactions. So the Corda network has been designed differently and architected differently so that it is horizontally scalable.
Fantastic. So just with 2 minutes left, I guess we should ask two things. One, as a developer, how would I get started with Ivno? And if not, just in the business side, and if this is more appropriate, how would somebody reach out to you to express interest and get started?
So sure, reach out on our website. We have a contact form, or reach out directly to me, ryan.ledhill@ivno.io. I'll put you in touch with some cleverer people than me for some of the business questions, but certainly I can answer the technical questions and get some developer onboarded.
The one question I didn't ask, which seems somewhat obvious in retrospect, why Ivno? What is the meaning of the name?
So Ivno was from the Roman god Juno, which is, I believe, Dan will kill me for not remembering this, one of the but it is the god of wealth, I believe. Okay,
excellent. It's a great name. Fantastic. Well, thanks for your time, Ryan. Thanks everybody for the questions. So thanks for bearing with us, Ryan, and everybody else on our first attempt at a live conversation.
Awesome. Thank you for all the great questions. I appreciate it.
Super. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.